What would Martin Luther King say if he saw John Boyega at that protest, in the middle of the crowd, his voice choked with emotion and his soul overflowing with courage? What would he say if he saw that young man raise his fist like he was carrying centuries of silencing on his back and yet still decide not to lower his head? Can you imagine how he would feel? Martin Luther King wouldn't just see a famous actor in front of cameras. He would see a black man saying enough, a man who grew up in a neighborhood where dreams don't last long because the system always finds a way to put down those who dream too much, a man who got to where they said he shouldn't, and who, upon reaching that place, discovered that being accepted doesn't always mean being respected. Because when John Boyega was cast as the lead in Star Wars, many people celebrated. It was the beginning of a new era, they said. But what followed was a script you know well. They put you in the window, call you a symbol, dress you in hope, and then reduce you to silence. That's what they did to him. Do you realize how much that hurts? Martin Luther King would see there the same pattern of erasure that he faced his whole life. He would recognize this mechanism with his eyes closed, the attempt to tame the strength of someone born to disrupt the comfort of those who have always dominated the stage. The same industry that said it wanted diversity treated Boyega as a risk for being too black, for talking too much, for existing too much. And you know what that means, because it's not just him. How many times have you also had to fit into a space that wasn't made for you? How many times have you felt like you needed to be smaller, to be accepted? Martin Luther King wouldn't speak softly about this. He would say firmly that we still live in a world where black people are only welcome if they don't take up too much space, where black presence still needs to be justified, where black talent only serves if it's not threatening, where inclusion is a facade and not a commitment. He would say that racism hasn't disappeared. It has only disguised itself. You saw what they did to Boyega. He was sold as the protagonist but soon pushed to the corners of the script. The lines diminished. The scenes were cut. His image, even, was reduced in promotional materials in other countries, and when he spoke about it, it wasn't with anger. It was with a kind of weariness that Martin Luther King would understand very well. Because what Boyega did at that protest wasn't just any speech. It was a rupture, a clean break in the silence they expected from him. When he said, "I don't know if I'm going to have a career after this, but fuck that," Martin Luther King would hear there the echo of so many who have already cried out for justice knowing they could lose everything. And even so, they cried out. It's easy to applaud a black person who stays silent, but it's impossible to ignore a black person who speaks from the heart. Martin Luther King would recognize the courage of this act, because he himself lived it. Every time he stepped into a pulpit, every time he marched through streets where they knew his name and wanted his death, he knew what was at stake. Just as Boyega knew. He knew that Hollywood doesn't like untamed voices. He knew that telling the truth about systemic racism costs. And yet he spoke. He cried. He stayed. And you? Have you ever had to choose between truth and comfort? Martin Luther King would tell you that the real test isn't when everything is easy. The real test is when you are alone, afraid, and yet still decide not to back down. He would say that there is no small gesture when the world wants to silence you, that there is no revolution without risk, and that every time a young black person raises their voice, they are not just fighting for themselves. They are breaking invisible chains that imprison an entire generation. Therefore, it's not about cinema. It never was. It's about the right to exist without having to apologize for it. Martin Luther King would see John Boyega as an uncomfortable reminder that equality hasn't arrived yet, that the applause only lasts until your voice threatens the system, and that racism continues to try to decide who can be the hero of their own story. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever been erased in silence even though you were there whole? Have you ever experienced the discomfort of knowing that behind every compliment there was an invisible limit? John Boyega lived it and decided to speak. Martin Luther King would tell you to pay attention to these moments, because it's in these instances when someone refuses to be diminished that the world changes a little. He would tell you not to wait for the right moment, because the right moment never comes. He would tell you not to accept crumbs of recognition, because you weren't born to be a supporting actor. You were born to exist fully, and the question that would hang in the air without an easy answer would be this: how long will you accept being less than you are? How long will you settle for small roles in stories that should be yours? Martin Luther King believed that every time someone tells the truth about racism, the world listens, even if it pretends not to hear. And when Boyega spoke, the world listened. It may have been uncomfortable, it may have turned away, it may have even tried to erase it again, but it listened. And now, you are listening too. And when you listen, you can no longer unlisten. Because the truth, when spoken with an open heart, no longer allows you to return to the comfortable silence of before. John Boyega didn't just shout for himself, he shouted for everyone who one day stayed silent because they were afraid of losing everything. And in that shout, Martin Luther King would see the beginning of something he knew well. Transformation begins when pain refuses to be just pain and becomes courage. Have you ever noticed how they try to disguise racism with smiles and contracts? How they make it seem like everything is fine while behind the scenes they still decide where black people can step and where they can't. Boyega was called a hero one day and treated as a burden the next. This is not new for those with dark skin. It's just the system adjusting the volume of your voice, applauding you when you entertain but ignoring you when you denounce. Martin Luther King would see in this gesture a warning. Black presence is uncomfortable when it ceases to be decorative, when it refuses to obey, when it dares to question the order of things. And you, who live this in your own skin or in the eyes of those you love, know well that there is no truly safe place when you are black. You know that every compliment comes with a shadow, that every open door can be locked by force, that every opportunity is a test of resistance disguised as a chance. And when Boyega spoke about it, it wasn't with hatred. It was with the sincerity of someone carrying unseen wounds. He didn't apologize for being who he is. And Martin Luther King would see in that the rebirth of a voice that no longer accepts being silenced. Do you understand the strength that exists in someone who, even afraid, doesn't back down? Have you ever felt that strength in yourself? Because it's not about Hollywood, it's not about cinema. It's about how much society still wants black people to limit themselves to the role it wrote. A role of servitude disguised as representation, a role of submission sold as conquered space. And Dr. King would say that this is not inclusion. This is control. He would say that we are being invited to parties where we can't dance, that we are being called to photos where we are always the last in line, that we are being heard only when our pain doesn't threaten the structure. But when someone speaks with the truth, the ground shakes, and what John Boyega did at that protest was that he shook the ground, and you felt it even from afar, because every time a black person refuses silence, others learn that they can also speak. Martin Luther King would talk to you about this with a firm gaze. He would ask you, how long will you be content not to be a bother? How long will you accept that your presence is tolerated but not respected? Because the fight is not over. It has only changed stages. And you are on that stage now. You see what happened to Boyega and maybe you think it's an exception, but you know it's not. You've seen it happen in other places, at your job, at school, in the sideways glance of someone who says nothing but judges everything. You know that today's racism is subtle, but it's no less cruel. It doesn't scream like before, but it still suffocates. It doesn't chain like before, but it still imprisons. Martin Luther King would speak of this with pain, but without resignation, because he believed more than anyone that freedom is not given, it is demanded. That dignity is not a favor, it is a right. And every time someone like Boyega stands up, that right is remembered again. It is demanded again. It bothers again those who preferred that everything remain as it is. Have you ever noticed how society deals with black people who refuse to be submissive? They try to silence them. They try to discredit them. They try to ridicule them. They say it's an exaggeration. They say it's whining. They say anything to avoid facing the fact that the problem is not in who speaks, but in who refuses to listen. And Dr. King wouldn't soften this for you. He wouldn't use light words to describe something so serious. He would say in no uncertain terms, racism is not an evil that has disappeared. It is an evil that has learned to wear a tie, to sign contracts, to hide in progressive speeches. But it's still there. And as long as it is, your voice needs to be too. He would look at you not with demand but with confidence, because he believed that each of us has a role that no one else can fulfill, and that when you are silent, it's not just you who loses, It's a whole people who lose. Martin Luther King believed that pain is only worth it if it becomes a bridge. And that fear only makes sense if it leads you to act despite it. He would see in you not just someone hurt by an unjust system, he would see in you the possibility of change that this system fears. Because what Boyega did was not an isolated act. It was an ignition, a snap, a shout that ignited other shouts, that awakened other voices, and you can be one of those voices. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought that maybe no one will give you permission and yet you need to speak? Have you ever thought that maybe your truth is exactly what someone needs to hear so they don't give up? Martin Luther King would tell you that the world needs uncomfortable truths more than it needs apparent peace, that the silence of the good is more dangerous than the hatred of the bad, and that every oppressive system depends on one thing to continue existing: fear. But when you overcome fear, the system begins to crack. It cracked when Boyega spoke. It cracks every time someone decides that they are no longer going to diminish themselves to fit in. Every time someone says, "I am more than the role they gave me." Every time someone says, "I am not going to be silent to please you." Do you feel that inside? Because Martin Luther King felt it, and he would see in you the same spark, the same uncomfortable flame, the same desire to live with dignity even if it costs dearly. Because living diminished costs even more. It costs the soul. It costs the essence. And no one was born to live erased. You need to understand one thing that Martin Luther King would repeat to you looking in your eyes, without looking away, without softening. As long as you silently accept every cut, every exclusion, every averted gaze, you reinforce the wall that they are trying to erect between you and dignity. Because the silence of the oppressed has never been rest. It's just another form of exhaustion. And you know well what that exhaustion is. You feel it when you enter somewhere and need to prove that you deserve to be there. When every achievement comes with suspicion. When your joy needs to be contained so as not to be read as arrogance. When your pain needs to be educated so as not to be called exaggeration. Have you ever felt the discomfort of being whole in a space where they only accept part of you? Dr. King would feel that in you, and he wouldn't judge you for having been silent, but he would remind you that this silence costs too high a price. And you may be tired, you may be confused, you may be just now beginning to realize the size of the game. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you listen to what Martin Luther King would shout now if he were by your side. No one will give you your place. Because it's not about giving you. It's about you knowing that it's already yours. And it's not about raising your voice at every moment. It's about recognizing when your voice has been lost. When you spent too much time trying to fit in. When you got used to being tolerated and confused that with respect. John Boyega didn't accept that. And he paid the price. And he inspired those who were afraid. Do you already understand the importance of that? Someone who decides not to follow the script becomes a threat. And that's why he was silenced in the movies. It wasn't because he didn't have talent, it was because he had his own light. Because if he shined too much, the system would need to change the narrative. And what do when the narrative threatens to escape control? They erase, they omit, they disguise. It's the same pattern. It doesn't matter if it's in cinema, in politics, in companies. If you are black and dare to cross the limit they gave you, they will try to pull you back to the role they wrote for you. But you weren't made for that role. Martin Luther King wouldn't give you gentle advice. He wouldn't ask you to wait. He would call you to presence. He would call you to truth, to face the discomfort of existing without asking permission. Because asking permission has never been freedom. And you know that. You don't have to mold yourself to a space that wasn't made for you. You have to question why that space continues to exclude. And that questioning begins in you. It begins when you decide that you are no longer going to soften your identity, that you are no longer going to accept less to maintain the peace of others. You don't need to raise any flag to understand that racism is real. You live it in your own skin. It's not a theory, it's a daily experience. And the problem is not you noticing. The problem is when you stop noticing, when you start adapting too much, when you start justifying the unjustifiable. Martin Luther King saw this happen to so many. He saw good people fading away little by little. He saw consciences being bought with small favors. He saw voices being silenced for fear of losing privileges that were never real. And if he were here with you now, he would ask you, Do you really want to live like this? Do you really want to live as a visitor in a world that is also yours? John Boyega said he didn't know if he would have a career after what he said, but he spoke because he understood that maintaining the role is no longer worth more than maintaining the soul, and when the soul rebels, no threat holds. Martin Luther King also knew that. He also knew that he was signing his own sentence by telling the truth, but he preferred the truth, because a life that does not take a stand in the face of injustice is a life that only serves to maintain injustice. And now you're here, with all of this laid out before you, with the choice to keep accepting things as they are or to start speaking up. Maybe you're afraid, maybe you're doubtful, but there's something inside you that's no longer satisfied with silence. If this resonates with you, if it exposes something within you, if it makes you remember moments you'd rather forget, then it's because something inside you is still alive. And as long as that's alive, there's still a chance for change. Martin Luther King believed in this, that every voice that rises up against racism plants a crack in the system, and that these cracks, sooner or later, bring down entire walls. You can be that crack. You can be the one who causes discomfort, not because you want confrontation, but because you refuse to be erased. You can be the one who speaks even when you're afraid, who shows that racism hasn't ended just because it's become more polite, who shows that representation without respect is just another form of control. You've carried this weight for too long. You've grown too used to walking hunched over. You've had to justify your presence too many times. Enough waiting to be invited. Enough accepting small spaces. Enough smiling to maintain the harmony of others while you fragment inside. If this makes sense to you, if you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't keep it to yourself. Someone close to you might be feeling the same way and thinking it's weakness. Show them it's not. Show them it's strength trying to find a way out. You don't need to be famous. You don't need to be an activist. You just need to be truthful. You just need to say what you already know. You just need to recognize that the time has come to no longer accept what diminishes you. And if you've made it this far, it's because that time has already arrived.